40 to 50 states, I think I'm only 20 or so.
Good evening, everybody. I'll get us started here. First, Alex, now I know why you work for the television station here. That is a voice. that is a voice. If James Earl Jones ever retires, you can do the voice. That was good. Professor Axelrod, it's nice to see you in this capacity. If anybody needs any opposition research on David, stop me after the event. I could show you the file. It's great to be here. I know everybody here shares that to be part of this great new adventure. You're starting here in Chicago, in a great political city. Let me start with the question for my panel simply about last night. As Alex noted, it's the first special election. We sometimes over-exaggerate the meaning. Certainly the candidates in the party sometimes over-exaggerate the meaning. But Kasie, I'll start at the end. This was a district, if you look at it, Alex Sink, the Democratic candidate, won it when she ran for governor. Obama carried it by 2 points when he ran for president. If you look at the demographic shifts in the district, it was one of the few places Democrats could have, some would argue should have, taken off the table in this election year. What does it mean?
The overall message that I took away from that is if Democrats aren't going to be able to pull out an election like this in a district like that, they're going to struggle a lot to hold on to the battleground states in other areas of the country where the president's numbers are much worse, places like Arkansas, even North Carolina, areas where they could potentially stand to lose the Senate. I mean, that said, I do think that you're right that we tend to sort of overread, and people did this in 2010 when Democrats won a selection of special elections going into what turned out to be an overwhelming Republican wave.
And Perry, do you think in the short term, Democrats are nervous today? They're trying to put on a great public face, but they know they probably could have and should have won this district. Will it in the short term cause any more retirements? We've seen a number of senior Democrats get out, largely because they don't foresee a situation where they get the gavel back. Henry Waxman will not be chairman. George Miller will not be chairman. Now, the primary deadlines were pushing up against them in a lot of places. Is it too late, or do you think that some people in the Congress will say, you know what, time to go home?
Most people who I thought would have retired already have, but I think it reinforces the message. If you look at the data, I think in the last 17 elections, when the president's party has 17 midterms, the president's party has lost seats in 15 of them. So the odds were already high. The Democrats were not going to gain seats. In some ways, we didn't learn a lot yesterday. The Democrats weren't going to gain seats in the House. We did that before, and this sort of reinforced that same message.
Is there anybody here, and I ask the question because of how we apportion our time going forward. I think we're going to spend most of our time talking about the Senate, some of our time talking about the governor's races, and then the bigger factors moving the electorate. Is there anybody here who still thinks, especially after what we learned last night, that there's, not that there's not any chance, there's always a chance, but there is a reasonable chance, Rick, of the Democrats getting the House?
I think yesterday should end that reasonable discussion. I think this is exactly the way that they would need to make inroads. This is the kind of situation where you have an opportunity like this. You have an open seat after a guy's there for 40 years. You have the demographics on your side. You have voters who maybe you can make the case to. If you can't get it done there, then it's hard to see how it gets done anywhere. So that's, I think, the biggest takeaway to me is that you can just kind of take that conversation off the table until or unless we have intervening events that change something. And then I think it's going to be for Democrats in the House just about how to stem the damage. Is there still an opportunity to pick up some seats? Is there an opportunity to not lose too much ground? Because look, we know the situation right now in the House, and John Boehner doesn't have a governing majority now. He certainly wouldn't if he loses any more ground. I think that's realistically the best the Democrats can hope for, and I think that's what I learned yesterday.
Everybody should feel free to jump in. Don't let me steer the entire conversation. But Beth, to that point, George W. Bush lost 30 seats in his 6-year midterm election. That's about the historical average. Most people don't think it could go that high because of how the seats are drawn now. There aren't as many competitive districts. With every cycle and every census and reapportionment, there seem to be fewer and fewer actually competitive House districts. But if we were talking a week ago that the conventional wisdom was 6 or 8 maybe as a gain for the Republicans in the House, does this make you think it could be 12 or 15?
I don't see why not. I mean, I think it's as Rick said, I think we can take the conversation off the table of Democrats regaining control, and I think it's only a question of how much of a gain will it be. Will we see a wave approaching what we saw in 2010, or will we see something slightly less dramatic? And I come to you bringing the new Wall Street Journal NBC News poll just out today. And the one group of folks standing in between another 2010 are women, which I thought was a really interesting finding in the poll. So I think you're going to see a lot of attention on female voters over the next few months.
And this is the paging David Axelrod moment, so I'll get to it because you mentioned this poll. The NBC Wall Street Journal poll, in a midterm election, almost every midterm election is driven first and foremost, and sometimes first and only, by where the president stands. The president right now in the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, which is the gold standard of polling. My organization conducts polling, everybody's organization conducts polling, but the NBC Wall Street Journal poll is done by a Democrat and a Republican. They're very serious guys. It's viewed largely as the gold standard. Doesn't mean it's perfect every time, but it's the gold standard in polling. Has the president at 41%. We could end the conversation right here. If the president's at 41% on election day, John Boehner will gain 15 or 20 seats, and the Republicans will get the Senate. I don't even think Mr. Axelrod would argue with me with that point. But at 41%, what's driving that?
Well, it's largely there's a lot of pessimism about the economy. Folks are not giving the president any credit for what, if you look at the numbers, the economy is getting better, slowly, but it is getting better. The president is not getting credit for that, and people are not feeling that the economy is getting better. 57% of the people in our poll said they still think we're in a recession. And increasingly, those are folks who are part of the president's base, women, African Americans. They're not feeling the relief that other folks are feeling, and so to them, things are not getting any better. And so there's a real despair about the economy, and there's also it's not just Obama they're disgusted with, it's all of the folks in Washington. It's the Democrats, it's the Republican Party who fared even worse in our poll than the president did. So it's just an overall real doldrums in the country.
And I think Beth got us something really important there, because I don't think it's just the healthcare law is unpopular, President Obama, we just don't like the guy. It's not just that. There's a bigger disconnect going on in this country right now between the perceptions and the realities and the way that the political class conducts itself, and a bigger frustration out there. I don't know the number for Republicans, because once you're like at 12 in a poll, it doesn't really matter, like it's 8 or 15 or whatever. But
it's low.
The congressional Republicans it's dirt.
Right.
So it's not just that people's anger is at the president. He happens to be the president. I think any president in this environment would face that. But there's something bigger, and it's a hard thing to put your finger on. But there's an element of people just don't feel like their problems are being dealt with. They don't feel like the political class is talking to them in an effective way. And I think any president at this point in his presidency would be facing a lot of those forces, even if he was a tremendously unifying force.
And is there anything, Kasie and Perry, that he can do about it? If you're at 41% and you're trying to convince the country, my words, not the president's, you're wrong. The economy's actually doing better. I know you might be hurting. You might be working 2 part-time jobs instead of the full-time job you had in 2007 or 2008 before the financial crisis, but it's getting better and it's coming your way. Stay with me. I'm on your side. This reminds me a little bit of George H.W. Bush running for president in 1992, when the data, unemployment, hiring, even the housing market started to get better, and he could wave the numbers and say, hey, I'm president, these are my numbers. Why won't they listen?
Right. Well, I mean, you have to remember, in a midterm election like this, it's actually, you have to look at this state by state. I mean, if we're thinking about the House, that's more susceptible to sort of a national wave, national mood sentiments. But if we're looking at control of the Senate as the most likely place that we're all going to be watching come November, each one of these states it's more driven by the candidates. It's more driven by like the atmosphere in a given state. So in Arkansas, do people feel completely disconnected from where the president is, or do they care a lot that Tom Cotton voted against the Farm Bill and they actually need the Farm Bill to keep their farm running? So I think that the president is going to have to consider that and sort of be, as Mr. Axelrod was discussing earlier, be surgical about how he sort of approaches meeting the goals that he's going to try to bring out of the
Continuing on that point, I can't imagine a lot of Senate races where they're going to be asking for Barack Obama to come and campaign with them. This is like the truth right now. They'd rather have Bill Clinton, they'd rather have Hillary Clinton with them, someone whose numbers are higher. What I think you're going to see in a lot of the Democratic Senate races is the Democrats' candidates, like I was in Kentucky with Allison Grimes, her message is not that the Democrats are doing well. Her message is going to be Mitch McConnell is much, much worse. And I think you're going to hear a lot of negative campaigning. If you look at Alex Sink's race last night even, it was hard to figure out what she was campaigning for, except the Republicans are really bad. And I think that's got to be the message going forward. Trying to defend the economy and trying to re-argue it's really well is not going to work. Saying the other guy will make it worse might be a better strategy, but it's kind of what happened in 2012 as well.
One thing I wonder about, because I've been sort of pondering, why aren't people giving the president any credit? And I wonder if a big part of it is the healthcare law that just sort of seems to drag everything down. That is just sort of in the way, and he can't get until people feel better about the healthcare law. I don't know if they'll feel better about the economy.
I should have said this at the beginning. We're going to take questions from the audience at some point. We're going to talk for maybe about another 15 or 20 minutes, so get your questions ready. I'm going to try to keep most of this conversation about 2014. There are 2016 implications. Some of that's a little more theatrical. We could have a more fun conversation about some of the personalities there, but I'm going to leave mostly that up to you, unless it comes to us naturally, because it was just mentioned you'll see Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton maybe more than you'll see President Obama on the trail. Let's focus on that point. I was struck on State of the Union night when the numbers were a little higher. I think he might have been at 44 then instead of 41. When on State of the Union night, this one not so much of a surprise, but Mark Begich, the Democratic senator from Alaska, was on our air, and he was asked, will you invite President Obama to campaign with you? And he said, no, but I will invite him to Alaska so I can tell him how wrong he is. So you're a Democrat not only running away from the president, but kicking the president. It's a bit disrespectful, but welcome to, there are no rules in today's politics. But then more striking to me was Mark Udall, the Democratic senator from Colorado, who's a gentleman, number one, if you know him personally, comes from a political family. His family has been in politics for generations, comes from a state that actually has an Obama base, has a growing Latino population, has those suburbs. You mentioned the women earlier, in the Denver suburbs, a place where you would think, I'm going to be a little bit more careful here. The president might be able to help me. And he said, I just don't see it happening. When you had that to begin with, Kasie, and then you have Florida, and then you have 41%. Are we going to see even more, if you can get more, of Democrats shoving the president away?
Well, that certainly happened. I was down in Arkansas speaking to Mark Pryor, and he said the exact same thing. He said, I'm not going to invite anyone down here to campaign with me, but if you want to come down and see what it's like in rural America, I'd be happy to show you around. That was sort of his overwhelming message to the president. So I don't think so. But my question about this year, though, in comparison to past years, is we've had Republican waves, we've had Democratic waves. I feel like this wave is turning into something that's strictly anti-incumbent. It's throw the bums out across the board. And so, I think that comes down on the president because at the end of the day, people see him as the ultimate incumbent. But I think it could affect many of these other races in different ways.
I was just going to add, in our poll, we asked about endorsements, and 42% said they would be less likely to vote for someone endorsed by the president. Now, Hillary did better than that, and Bill Clinton did even better than that. And what's most interesting about President Clinton's numbers is that he's popular in regions like the South, where the hostility to President Obama is the sharpest. And, like Kasie mentioned, him campaigning in Kentucky, I think we'll also see him, because there are so many big Senate races up in the South. If we see anyone in Arkansas or North Carolina or Louisiana,
Harry Reid said exactly that.
Yeah.
He was asked, should Obama go campaign for Mark Udall in Colorado, and he said, well, we have one Democratic president who can go every place, and that's Bill Clinton.
And Allison Grimes in Kentucky a couple weeks ago at the event Perry mentioned, I'm a Clinton Democrat, she said, which is an extraordinary thing when you think about what the journey of the Clintons over the last couple of decades. It's really remarkable. But yes, that there's some appeal there that, and I think there's a hope among Democrats that he's got the secret sauce, that he can pull it out for people. I'm skeptical as to whether he can do that. I think he can certainly be a draw in places, but I don't think he's going to carry people over the finish line in Arkansas and Louisiana and Kentucky, for instance.
Yeah.
The one thing, though, that I think is interesting that, when we sort of step back, a lot of these senators, especially, who were first elected in 2008 when President Obama was at the top of the ticket. And they came in on this wave where, the Obama campaign was driving minority turnout in a very sort of aggressive way. And that's going to be missing in a lot of these places. And I think that that's probably something that, while on the one hand they don't necessarily want the president's help, they could potentially lose their elections because they can't accept it or because they feel they can't accept it.
And let's dig deeper on that, because I think there are a couple of races. I mean, the president's not going to help in Alaska, but if you look at the Arkansas calculation, if you look at the North Carolina calculation,
Louisiana, where there's
potentially
a lot of
Louisiana,
African-Americans.
maybe Kentucky, and if the Ohio race becomes close, there are a couple of races to watch. Sherrod Brown in Ohio looks good right now. Al Franken in Minnesota looks okay right now. If those are competitive after Labor Day, you sort of get a sense of what's happening in the country. But could a Kay Hagan wake up the morning after the election in North Carolina, lose by a point or two, and think, you know what, I should have gambled. I should have brought him in here because those people who are anti-Obama weren't going to vote for me anyway, and African-American turnout tanked?
I mean, John, I know from talking to her campaign, they've thought about this issue. They've really, in Louisiana and North Carolina, they've thought about, and Guy Cecil's talked about this a lot too, how do you get black turnout really high while not bringing Barack Obama down here and not having him to turn off other kinds of voters? They've studied this a lot. Claire McCaskill did really well in 2012 with black turnout, even though Obama didn't campaign in Missouri. This is an issue I think you can do. You might be able to get black turnout to be higher than you like it to without necessarily bringing Obama to campaign for you. But it's something worth studying because in general, turnout is lower among blacks, Latinos, and young voters in midterms, and this is a perennial Democratic problem. And if they can't address it this time, it'll be even worse in Colorado, in North Carolina, states like that.
Odd after the last two presidential elections to have a conversation in which you say, because of historical turnout, the Republicans have a demographic advantage this year. If you look at, not just nationally, but if you look at where these big Senate races are and the populations in those states, most of them pretty modest Latino population. If the president stays away, some of them have modest African-American population anyway, but if that turnout is deflated by the president, which is sort of weird when you look at a presidential race where the Republicans still have this monumental demographic crisis and challenge. If not the president, this is more a question for the young people in the room. Younger voters, another key constituency, they have no memory of the Bill Clinton presidency. Can he motivate turnout?
I'm skeptical around. In the sense that you identified that it's not the same turnout model. Obviously, I think the Bill Clinton efforts are going to be more about trying to get people with maybe historic Democratic affiliation who haven't voted for a Democrat in a long time back out there, a feeling of a blue-collar Democrat, that there's a disconnect in the modern Democratic Party led by Barack Obama. They can go back to the Clinton years. But there is something still stirring with the Clintons, and this gets into the 2016 discussion that I'm sure we'll get to later, but there is the sense of yearning for the next thing, and a lot of that has to do with Hillary, and a lot of the popularity around Bill Clinton, I think, is the expectation of Hillary running, the expectation that that's out there, and that maybe she can kind of complete the promise that we saw Barack Obama offer in his two elections.
All right. So let's go through some of these other races, and let's start with this premise. If you look at the map right now, there are 12 or 13, maybe 14 Democrat-held Senate seats that you look at as potentially moving this year. I count only two, please disagree, Republican seats that as of now you look at. The Kentucky race, which we've talked about, which the Democrats are salivating for. You remember a few years back, the Republicans took out Tom Daschle when he was the leader of the Democrats in the Senate in South Dakota. Well, payback is, you can finish the sentence. And they're looking to get Mitch McConnell in Kentucky. Can they? Tough. Not since Wendell Ford in, 1992? Has Kentucky sent has Kentucky sent a Democrat to federal office, statewide federal office? But we'll see what happens there. And Georgia, which will bring me to another part of this conversation, is a place where some people say this is going to be a big Republican year unless they screw it up. And if you've watched the government shutdown, they're perfectly capable of doing that. And so let's start in Georgia, and then we'll go to the more interesting race from a candidate perspective in Kentucky. The issue there is, and you see several of these, do you have a Republican primary process that, because of their own internal disagreements and in some cases civil wars, produces a candidate that could make a Democrat electable to the Senate in Georgia?
Right. Call it the Todd Aiken problem, and Georgia is sort of ground zero for that. Republicans are very nervous about the primary there because there's a couple candidates, I'll say, are undisciplined, to put it politely, that have
very polite.
made comments that are many people would consider extreme and insensitive, and so that is sort of a crapshoot. And like you said, that has made Democrats look at this as a possible pickup with Michelle Nunn, who is very much less colorful than these guys that she's running against, and perhaps much more appealing, and able to have that crossover appeal.
Now, that's another state where would Michelle Nunn call the president if she's in a 48 race?
She will not be calling the president.
I think unlikely, but I think clearly in 2010 and 2012, Republicans left seats on the table. They had opportunities that if they had nominated the right candidate, Aiken in Missouri or Murdoch in Indiana, or going back to Sharon Angle and Christine O'Donnell. I mean, that's
Colorado.
Ken Buck. That's five right there. That's you almost at the majority right there. They have a history of this. It's a recent history. I think there's a decent chance that they don't go into that again, but it's still out there. There's this Tea Party energy that is driving it, and Georgia's the best example out there right now where they could screw it up by getting to the wrong candidate.
Now, you mentioned Colorado. We just saw some evidence of how aware of this in the last couple of weeks. The business community and the establishment community talked Ken Buck out of running for Senate again, and they told him they'd support him if he ran for a House district. I guess they don't mind if they send him to the House. And another candidate dropped out. So there's one Tea Party still, but they got more of a mainstream conservative Republican to run, which makes you think that seat might be a little bit more in play. Let's move this. So they show discipline there. Let's move this to Kentucky. Matt Bevin is the Tea Party challenger to Mitch McConnell. If you look at the polls today, Bevin has been an imperfect candidate. He's made some mistakes, and he said some things that aren't necessarily in sync with the Tea Party. But those races in the past, some of them have broken late, and Kentucky's example, Exhibit A, among them. Do you see Bevin taking out McConnell?
Bevin, so one of the secrets about Bevin is that he's not actually a Tea Party candidate. He's an evangelical who's been embraced by many of these sort of overarching Tea Party groups, and that has gotten him into a little bit of trouble, and he talks around it a little bit. I spent some time with him and his family, and as you noted, he is undisciplined. He's said some things that have caused him to have to sort of walk back or re-embrace sort of his Tea Party credentials. Some of it hasn't been his mistake. Some of it has been the campaign that McConnell's run against him, and I think that's the key difference here. McConnell has clearly recognized from the very beginning that the key to beating these Tea Party challengers is to pay attention to them early, because that was the mistake that his colleagues who lost made oftentimes. They ignored them. They didn't pay any attention. So McConnell has been spending all kinds of money. He's dug up all sorts of research on this guy. He's sort of very systematically laid out one opposition hit after the other, and then taken those and hammered him on the airwaves. And what you're seeing as a result is polling that has Bevin very far behind McConnell. So while I take your point that these races break late, I think McConnell has done absolutely everything in his power to prevent that from happening.
Another thing he has by his side, and it's a sort of an interesting marriage, is Rand Paul. Who
Right.
Rand Paul did to Mitch McConnell in the primary against Trey Grayson, who's got a job at some other institution, some faraway
John,
place.
can I add one more
Yeah,
point
sure,
on this?
please.
There's an interesting debate within the Republican Party about how to govern. I think these races are important for that reason too, because you have in Kansas, Mississippi, Kentucky, North Carolina, and Georgia, you have sort of a Mitch McConnell style conservative, a traditional Republican in each race. So running against kind of a Tea Party ideological style person. Like Matt Bevin talks about how he wants to be like Ted Cruz. And you have that within each one of these races. And you could have a situation, the debate, like Mitch McConnell said the other day, they want to crush all these Tea Party contenders. And they want to purge that part of the party. So Mitch McConnell wants to run a Senate in which he's not dealing with the Ted Cruzes of the world and so on. And the internal debate between the parties is really interesting here and maybe more meaningful than anything else that happens is, do you see a bunch of Republican senators who come back next year who want to be Ted Cruz and want to be Rand Paul and want to be really conservative and make a lot of noise? Or do we end up with a bunch of Republican senators who are more establishment-y, more safe? And that's a big question for governing too, because the government shutdown happened in part because of the Ted Cruz wing is getting more strong. Does they get weaker or stronger when we get back with this election?
And even in a year, assume Republicans win a lot of those races no matter who they nominate. I think that is, Perry hits the defining question. Do you get, well, I call them the parliamentary conservatives. They want to be the opposition party. They want to come to Washington and say no, especially if Obama is president. Whereas John Boehner wanted to do immigration reform, actually wants to do it in his heart. He thinks it's the right thing to do, pulled it back because the Tea Party guys say no. We'll give you grief here. Plus some of his establishment guys said, the filing deadlines haven't passed. You make me vote for that, I'm going to get a primary challenge. And so they pulled it back. You do have this tension. It's fascinating. So for McConnell to say, Mitch McConnell, like him or not, is one of the most disciplined politicians in the country. I call him the new Dick Cheney of Sunday show interviews. It's the Sphinx. If he doesn't want to tell you anything, he's not going to tell you anything. So he says we're going to crush them everywhere. But clearly they're under his skin. They've cost him a couple of his close friends. Bob Bennett from Utah was probably his best friend in the United States Senate. Dick Lugar, as an establishment Republican, the Tea Party gets him. So now they're challenging McConnell. They just lost. They try to take out John Cornyn in Texas. Lamar Alexander, I don't see it now, but you watch it. Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, excuse me.
Pat Roberts.
Yes, you have in Kansas, Pat Roberts, although the candidate there has posting certain images on the internet. Rule number 1, Democrat, Republican, Independent, be careful what you post on the internet.
It's a good life lesson.
It's a new rule. It's a new rule. But for him to say that, number one, it proves they're under his skin, and he's starting to boil over a little bit. But number two, he must be supremely confident.
Or you know, the way I read it, and I thought it was probably a misguided thing to say this at this point in the cycle, because you're sort of stirring the beast, you're poking him a little bit. It's a signal. My guess would be you do this in an article in the New York Times because you want to signal to your big donors, we can do this if we stay disciplined, if we open up those checkbooks and crush these people. But don't forget that we have to do it, and it means writing a lot of big checks, and it means some really ugly battles over the next couple months. He feels confident that he's close enough now that he can go out and say it, but I think he's also speaking to a donor base. And look, the Republican establishment would love to make the Tea Party quiet and go away. They do want it, as Perry's point about governing, they don't want government shutdowns. This is the business community. They want the predictability of this. They want a functioning government. They want a conservative government. They want lower taxes. They don't want Obamacare, all that. But they want the thing to work. And I think they see, if they can signal now, look, you got a chance to shape the field in a way that's going to allow us to keep the lights on. That's something tempting.
Yeah, and it goes to also what kind of Senate does Mitch McConnell want to lead, right? I mean, if they do take back the Senate, you know, the thing about Ted Cruz, and one of the things that's enabled him to do what he's done, is that he had zero support from the establishment at the beginning. He is not beholden to the NRSC. He is not beholden to the RNC. He's beholden to the Club for Growth and a lot of these, you know, moneyed Tea Party groups. And that's exactly who he acts on behalf of. And that's made it very, very difficult for McConnell to, you know, actually govern. And he cares, like John Boehner, does care very much about governing, which I think the Obama administration has sort of reluctantly come to realize.
And that's one of the big interesting points that make this cycle different than more historical cycles, maybe not so much 2010 or 2012, but this is the first sort of full post-Citizens United midterm cycle that we see going on. And we saw a little bit of this in Florida, where the parties, the RNC and the DNC, or the Republican Senatorial Committee and the Democratic Senatorial Committee, and the same for the House committees, are less relevant. Because the big bucks are coming from these outside groups. And on the Republican side, let's stick there for a minute, so far most of them have taken that establishment message, unlike the last time where you saw a lot more money going in against establishment figures. Most of them, maybe because McConnell's threatened them, have backed off. Do you see that now that you're baiting them, by him laying down to crush them? Is that going to force more picking sides, if you will?
Well, it's interesting, it was a year ago that Crossroads, who was the big super PAC in 2012, you know, founded by Karl Rove, said on the front page of the New York Times, we are going to get involved.
Since when do conservatives communicate in the New York Times? I'm sorry, Karl Rove, Mitch McConnell.
When they're speaking to their donors, as Rick correctly pointed out. So that was sort of a declaration of war against the Tea Party. That was a year ago. Since then, Crossroads has not spent a dime in a Republican primary. Why is that? There's a few reasons. One is because some of the Tea Party candidates have fizzled and not been as threatening as they thought. And the other one is, like you said, when you poke, and that was, of course, you know, part of that declaration of war was about Iowa, was about you know, cowing Steve King, the you know, pretty uncontrollable congressman, into not running for the Senate. He did back down.
We'll take about 5 more minutes with us, then we'll get to some questions here. So as we do, let me try to circle it back to the broader dynamics, and then we'll get more specific questions from the audience. We've started with the fact that the president's at or near a low point, depending on which poll you want to read, but he's at or near a low point. He's not welcome in a lot of these places. He's still the president of the United States, and we don't have 2 ferns to put us between here. But if we had 2 ferns, you know, he's communicating differently, and that's smart. You know, maybe some of you think it's demeaning to the presidency. I think it's communicating in the world we live in of 1,600 channels and the internet. I made the mistake on television the other morning of saying the web series, Funny or Die, and all the young people said, we don't call it the web, old man. We call it the internet. Thank you, sorry. Can he drive the debate in Washington by focusing on the minimum wage, focusing on, you know, issues? Can he at least be a plus for the Democrats in terms of the issues dynamic, or is he, to go back to the Clinton era question, not relevant?
I would say he's relevant to government in terms. I think we think a lot in terms of, if a bill is not passed in Congress, nothing is happening. If you look at what's happening on climate change, there's a lot of things moving on climate change, to restrict emissions, to change how that issue works. But it's all happening through his executive power. I think he smartly decided Congress, that lane is closed, and doing a lot of really important things on the executive front. But do I think him talking about the minimum wage is going to change a lot of races? No, I don't think. I think Allison Grimes says, in Kentucky, says, I'm for the minimum wage. She doesn't say, I'm for the minimum wage with Barack Obama. I think they're going to really try to avoid, like these candidates, like Kasie was saying, these Senate candidates for the Democrats want to run their own campaigns away from Obama as much as possible. But I don't think that means he's irrelevant, because I think he has a lot of influence in terms of governing.
It's air support. I think if he can move the debate a little bit in the direction of income inequality and of social justice, then I think at the margins you can help Democrats and drive up turnout, which I think is really what it's aimed for. But I don't think that the midterms are going to be decided on the minimum wage or overtime, that initiative that's getting announced this week either. I don't think we're that stage of the president's popularity or his sway even of the national agenda that he'll suddenly make it about that. But at the margins, if we're talking a little bit more about minimum wage is a clear winner for Democrats. The polling shows it. Why not? And I think most Democrats, I haven't looked at all of them, but yeah, in the Senate races, yeah, sure, I'm for that.
Well, I mean, anything that takes his own approval rating up is good for Democrats across the country. Second of all, Beth's point about women is well taken. I mean, I think it's sort of become widely acknowledged that Democrats view the gender gap as the way to win in this election cycle. And most of these issues that they're talking about at a national level, the minimum wage, they're very much sharpening that message and pointing it straight at women voters. I mean, that's sort of the point of the whole thing. That said, I mean, the president's sort of efficacy in Congress is sort of even more stalled than it's ever been. I mean, they've been trying to move some of these priorities through the Senate, and they keep running into trouble. They ran into trouble extending unemployment insurance, which had been, an uncontroversial thing. The minimum wage has even run into trouble because people like Mark Pryor in Arkansas don't want to jump on board with the federal minimum wage because they're afraid of even being that close. Pryor endorsed a state bill to raise the state minimum wage, but he didn't want to do it with the president.
So I'm going to ask a question here. We'll see if Mr. Axelrod objects to the question. If you're this president of the United States, and you know you're going to have roughly divided government, you assume the Republicans are going to pick up some seats in the House, maybe 10 or 12, maybe 15, maybe just 6 or 8. He has said publicly his #1 goal this year is to protect the Democratic Senate. If you're thinking legacy and you want to pass immigration reform and do tax reform and maybe do Medicare and maybe do Social Security, privately, do you want Harry Reid back at 51? Or do you want Mitch McConnell at 54? And like Bill Clinton, you do some business with a Republican Congress and get big things done?
That's a fascinating little thought experiment.
When you talk to the portraits in the White House, it's all presidents do.
I think it depends on the 54, but I tend to believe the 54 will include Ted Cruz and Rand Paul having a lot of influence, and John Boehner and the Tea Party caucus. The Tea Party caucus and House have a lot of influence. I don't see a lot of bills where Barack Obama wants to sign them that have passed in the House with the majority of the Republican House being for it, that have passed in the Senate with Ted Cruz and Rand Paul. Now, once you've gotten to that process, I don't know what the bills look like that the president wants to sign.
Well, and take an immigration bill, for example, which would be one of the big pieces of legislation on the table. I mean, that would give Republicans an opportunity to, make all of the strides that they've been attempting to make, inroads, be able to claim, we did immigration reform for the Hispanic community, while I'm sure many of the sort of Latino immigration reform advocacy groups would be up in arms because there's no way such a bill would include, say, a path to citizenship. Right. And then the president is maybe forced to sign or veto that bill. I mean, that's a tough position to be in, potentially.
Right, and that's an interesting point you make, because I thought it was very telling. The president, not that long ago, in an interview with CNN's Jake Tapper, he's always drawn the line at path to citizenship. He's always said you have to do that. You can't have 2 classes of citizens in the United States. And he left it open, I think on purpose, to give Boehner room, because Boehner said he wanted to advance a bill. And Jake said, well, will you veto anything short of path to citizenship? And the president said, I'm not going to prejudge anything. There he was trying to give Boehner room, and then Boehner had to drop it because Boehner's playing to the base. Now, I'm not just going to, Republicans aren't the only ones just playing to the base. The president from this year's budget dropped the Social Security reform, the chained CPI. Is everyone an expert on chained CPI? It's a more modest way of giving cost of living increases to people on Social Security. It was outreach to the Republicans last year. He pulled it back this year because his base says over my dead body. So let's everyone make one last observation about the thing you're most looking for as we move forward from March to November when it comes to 2014, and then we'll take some questions, so please get ready.
Okay. I'm most looking for how far out the field is going to expand. What races are we going to be talking about? Because we started out with 6 states where Democrats are defending their seats, southern states, Louisiana, Arkansas. We've since expanded it to Colorado, maybe Virginia, maybe not. But I think that there may be others that get added to that list. And I think that's where Democrats could get into real trouble.
I'm looking at the governor's races and the state legislative races. My sense is Washington in 2015 and 2016 is just not going to accomplish very much. And the real legislating, if you saw a Wendy Davis is not going to win, but if Wendy Davis won, that'd be a really huge story, and that would also be a big public policy change in America. If Charlie Crist wins in Florida, that will change how Obamacare works in Florida. I really think the state races, states are where the governing is happening right now, and that's going to allow me to watching a lot.
I'm looking at the Tea Party, and I think there is still a war inside the Republican Party about the direction to go, and it's being papered over by the fact that they're likely to have a very good midterm election year. But as we discussed with these primaries, it could cut into their ability to make gains, and I think it will have very large implications going forward, 2016 and beyond, the way that this fight sorts itself out. I don't expect it to be settled this year, but these party primaries could go a long way towards saying, look, how are we going to actually govern as a party? What's the direction we're going to go?
I'm looking at turnout. What kind of electorate are we going to see? And if the Florida race is any sign, it's going to be extremely favorable for Republicans. The reason Terry McAuliffe is governor of Virginia is because he got Obama-like turnout, and certainly wasn't approaching the president's numbers, but he got young women, he got African Americans, he got Hispanics to turn out. Alex Sink did not, and her district didn't really allow for that as much. Which brings us to immigration. So that was the big takeaway, right, from the 2012 election. Republicans felt that it was an imperative. They would never get to the White House. Now we see it's like been set aside, right? And now they're feeling kind of confident. They've got Obamacare. Like things are really looking good. We don't need immigration. And something Professor Axelrod said a minute ago, this could lead to Republicans taking away from a big 2014 election, oh, we don't need those Hispanics after all. But as everyone in this room knows, the electorate changes dramatically in a presidential year. And so that may come back to haunt them.
At a presidential level, that would be a galactic mistake. But one of the interesting points, if you look at this, go online and look at this. The president's won 2 huge electoral college victories, and yet the Obama years have been great for the Republican Party. If you look at their House majority, they're on the cusp of at least making the Senate if not 50-50, maybe getting a majority. Then look at the governors, they have 29 of the 50, and look at the state legislatures. The Republicans, the Republican bench, the next generation, they have more state legislative seats than ever. So we have 2 Americas politically, not just economically. We have 2 Americas politically. The last point I'll make is to follow up on Perry's point. Watch the governor's races. He makes a very good point, an important point about from a policy standpoint. Watch them also politically, because if Republicans feel they have a wind at their back, even in a post-Citizens United world, you can do a lot of business with state campaign finance laws and governor's races in terms of directing turnout and directing money. And in 1994, that's how Republicans got from 40 to 52. Their governors were winning big everywhere, and they moved extra money through the state parties and through the gubernatorial campaigns to help congressional candidates. And it made a big difference in 1994 and got them more seats. So watch that. If you have a Republican governor of Michigan, if he can win re-election, you might be able to take an extra House seat there. Pennsylvania will be an interesting race. If the Republican is in good standing there, can you somehow sneak some money in and take something? And there are a couple Senate races that overlap with governor's races, and there could be some play there. Who's going to take the lead now? I saw Professor Axelrod get up and left. I guess, is he hiding on us, or do you have to leave?
He got bored.
You're going to take here, okay. We have Oprah has the microphone here. She'll also give you a car when we're done.
I actually don't know how to drive, so.
Oprah, you just saved a car.
Thank you. So I was wondering, how much is the Affordable Care Act a factor in this midterm election compared with the economy and other issues? And since now we're still 8 months away from the election, as the Affordable Care Act is slowly starting to work in some way and more people are getting insured, how much firepower is there still left from the right in terms of attacking it? And could the issue flip to the right side as time goes on?
It's a great question. As the enrollment numbers, they're not where they want to be, but they've improved significantly from the early rollout days. Is it baked in, Kasie? Is it, especially, again, that's a national question, but when you look at these Senate states especially, is opposition to Obamacare baked in, or could it be twisted.
I think that the botched rollout of the website, while yes, it was just a website, and while yes, people are now getting insurance, I think that that sort of came to embody the sort of incompetence that people are just fed up with. So I think that created a problem for the administration and for the healthcare law, and in the term that's, the near term being through November. And I think it's, in some of the races I've covered, people have identified that as a turning point. So I think that that's going to be problematic. I think, if they can take advantage of people who are getting insurance and turn them out to vote, that certainly could potentially swing. But I mean, at this point, I just think it's a rough road ahead.
Important phrase, turn out to vote. People who are uninsured tend to be lower income and younger and more likely minorities, and the kinds of people who, as we've noted 4 or 5 times now,
Right.
don't tend to vote in midterms. So that is another thing. You might have people, I was in Kentucky actually and met people, Kentucky is a conservative state, we should know too. I met people who have been newly insured and talked about how they like their new insurance. But they don't really give Barack Obama a lot of credit for that. And they're not looking to vote for Democratic candidates for president. It's more like, well, I guess this worked out. This is one thing he did right, but I still don't like him. And I don't think that the large number of people getting health insurance is really going to be a political boon for
And
Democrats.
Kentucky's a state where it's worked well
Exactly.
in comparison
Still,
to other
yeah.
states.
Right, we have a Democratic governor who's been quite aggressive in implementing it. I will say this to that point, and then we'll take another question. Please don't be shy, folks. The executive director of the Democratic Senatorial Committee is back for his 3rd cycle now, which people just don't do, but in part because the Democrats defied historical averages and performed better than expected in the last 2 cycles, so they brought him back. They understand that the Republicans are going to be running against health care, so watch the Democratic ads in these Senate races. They're essentially going to say, Republicans don't cause cancer, but they make it worse, by trying to take away your health care. They are going to be incredibly just hardball, use a gentle term, in their advertisements, and we'll see if they move races. We'll see if they move races. They're not doing that because they're sure it will work. They're doing it because they know the opposition to Obamacare and the other guys' ads are going to be pretty high. Who's got a question? Oh, we can't have a silent group like this in the city of Chicago. Sir, go ahead.
Will the Obama political operation be in effect in this race? They surprised the Republicans. Romney thought he was going to win right through Election Day, but they turned out the vote, micro-targeting, etc. Will that play a role at all?
Well, the campaign has sort of evolved now into organizing for action, right? That's what it's called now, which is, it's essentially a lobbying group. It's an advocacy group. They don't play an election. So, if you look at least that part of the Obama machine, they won't be participating. One of the super PACs that was very helpful to Obama Priorities, which raised a ton of money and ran those ads, maybe you remember, with all the poor people who lost their jobs because of Mitt Romney. It's unclear whether they're going to be spending any money. They're gearing up for Hillary Clinton in 2016. So I don't know that you're going to see that kind of Obama machine.
This is a big issue among Democrats, and you talk to people associated with the White House and or 2016 thinking about Hillary, or versus people that are laser focused on these congressional races. They are freaked out about the fact that there isn't an operation out there that's ready to turn up the heat that they do in a presidential year. Now, maybe that they couldn't do it to the same extent without Obama on the ballot. You're not going to get that kind of turnout. But all of the talk now about 2016 is a problem when you talk about 2014, and the fact that OFA hasn't really developed into an effective force for legislation or for politics other than in a presidential year. It's a big issue. The vaunted data and all of the great turnout operations that we've heard about, the edge switches to Republicans all of a sudden, despite all their problems. It's not that Republicans have gotten better. It's just that Democrats haven't really figured out how to make this work in an off year.
And I think one thing that'll be interesting to watch is how much Hillary Clinton does step forward and talk about the importance of 2014. I mean, she's obviously stayed very much off the radar now, but she is set to go on a big book tour. We'll see if she endorses any candidates in 2014. I mean, if you think about it from her perspective, I mean, no, presidential candidate necessarily wants to go into this election. Well, I mean, it's possible she could actually benefit from having, both houses controlled by Republicans and that angering people. But at the same time, if she steps out there and sort of signals to this apparatus that is frankly lining up behind her, that could potentially help Democrats in the midterms, I think.
And to your point about the technology, we'll see what happens going forward. As Rick noted, the Republicans have had their butts kicked in the last couple of cycles in terms of micro-targeting, the use of technology to identify, organize, and turn out voters. The Republicans do say they're their reboot, to use the technical term, last night worked in Florida. They believed in that one district. They made progress, at least better than they have been in cycles past. We'll see if they can grow that as we go toward November. It's a huge priority for the Republicans. It's been a problem. Who's next?
Hi, this is kind of addressed to Beth. I'm a former 15-year Miami resident, and I worked on a lot of campaigns down in Miami and also like in the governor's races. Alex Sink couldn't be elected dog catcher. I mean, she's just I'm serious, she has no people skills. She's not good in a crowd. I was with her at campaign events years ago. I don't see how she could have ever won any race. It was not surprising to me at all. The Central Florida Democratic Party keeps coming up with bad candidates for statewide office. Would you agree?
Well, as a former Miami Herald reporter, I covered her husband's gubernatorial campaign, and he was an awkward candidate, and Alex Sink at that time, she was the candidate's wife, and it was a lot easier, I think, for her to be charming and interesting, and everyone seemed to say, a lot of people in that campaign said, why isn't she running? So then she ran, and then we saw what kind of candidate Alex Sink was, and she was, as you say, a very nervous, awkward candidate. And once again, I think, I obviously didn't cover this race as closely, but you're right. I mean, doesn't have the people skills that I don't know if that would have helped. Sometimes these things are won and lost in TV more than they are in person to person. I remember once interviewing her, this was a few years ago, so I had a BlackBerry, and she looked at it and she said, "Is that on?" She thought it was a tape recorder. She was just she was just nervous. She was very nervous. And so I think that was a problem, and it made her cautious as well.
I respond with 2 words: Martha Coakley. I heard a lot of stories about her. She's this terrible candidate. It's not a sign of anything except she's just a bad candidate. No. When she lost in 2010, that was a sign of broader things. And I don't want to blame a campaign. Alex Sink had trouble defending the Obamacare rollout. This is a fundamental part of her race. And I don't think we should take too much out of it, but I don't want to blame it too much on the specific candidate either.
I think that's a good point. And Dave Jolly, if you know him at all, was no world beater. I mean, that guy had a real, he had a lot of discipline problems, and the party had problems communicating with him, and he ended up denouncing ads, and the NRCC pulled funding at the end for him. I mean, the other thing I note about that race is that the Libertarian candidate got 5 points in that race. I mean, that if you were to chunk that back into the Republican, that was a blowout. I agree with Perry. There's a tendency in Washington to turn on your own after you lose and talk about how this is the worst candidate in the history of politics, and that was the mistake. When there's something more fundamental going on, and sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. You win or lose campaigns for lots of reasons.
First of all, thank you for coming to speak with us. I'm actually voting in my first election coming up, so it's really nice to hear from you all. Earlier, you mentioned that there was kind of a disconnect and discontent between the people in Washington and those of us who are actually voting. My question is, what do you think that's going to mean for voter turnout in the upcoming election?
Who wants to jump in first?
Well, I think there's an edge for Republicans because they feel like there's more at stake. There's something that's unifying Republicans, and his name is Barack Obama, and it's the Democratic Party right now. Now, he goes away in a while, but then there's the natural order of these things. The Democrats did very well in the 2006 midterms, if you recall, because the Iraq War and President Bush, and he was the unifying force. He was the thing that brought them together. So the stakes just aren't there for Democrats, and they haven't proven yet that they can come together just to defend something that the president is doing and to keep the ball rolling when it comes to the Democratic agenda. I think the broader Washington disaffection, I don't know where it ends up. I mean, you tend to think you can't just keep having these elections that, waver in these wild directions or just ratify a status quo that no one likes. There has to be kind of an intervening bigger thing. I don't think that bigger thing's on tap this year. There's no sign to me anyway that this is going to be the big thing that shakes up Washington out of its very long slumber.
Go ahead, Kasie.
Just some of the, and you as somebody who's young and is voting in your first election, some of the trust in our institutions is sort of at an all-time low, which I think is sort of an interesting broader trend. And Pew did some interesting polling recently that showed that millennials are less connected to religious institutions, less connected to social groups, the Rotary Club. You name it. There's just sort of this feeling of discontent, and I'm curious to see if that sort of takes root and fundamentally changes the way we do our politics, or whether that's just something that's, a product of a bad economy and sort of a dragged out, recovery that's really only benefited, the top 10% of the country at the expense of the rest.
You have the right to prove us wrong, prove history wrong, in the sense that in midterm elections, the turnout that tends to drop the most from presidential years, younger people, African Americans, Latinos. And the Republicans know that, and if you just look at the last several years of elections, if young turnout, Latinos and African American turnout drops, well, guess who wins, or who benefits anyway. So you have a chance to prove history wrong, and you should do that. Everybody should do that. It would be a good thing for the process. To Rick's point, I think what's going to be interesting, I think turnout's going to be low anyway, because people are mad at all incumbents. One of the reasons Mitch McConnell's in trouble is because he has a title. He works in Washington, and he has a big title. If you have a big title and you work in Washington, the voters think you're an idiot, and you should be retired. And they have pretty good reason to think that, actually, in many cases. But I think in the non-competitive races, that it's going to be depressing. Because people are people across the board, if there's bipartisan agreement on anything, it's discussed with Washington right now. And I think in places where you don't have competitive races, the turnout is going to be depressing. Right here. Here, I'm sorry, go ahead. You have a question here? You go, and then we'll move here.
So can you, there seems to be a certain sort of split between people who rely more on analytics and people who rely more on horse race sort of reporting in terms of how they see how a race is doing or how a race could turn in especially in battleground states. Like, how do you all sort of see that split, and do you use analytics, or what role does analytics play versus what role does horse race reporting play for you all?
I'll make an observation, then I'll move it down the line, because I think everybody probably wants to weigh in quickly on this. Look, technology, analytics, study of data is a great advantage, and it is, if you go back to the last campaign of Nate Silva, for example, he's very good at what he does. If you're good at what you do and you can scrub the data right and you can look at historical trends right, it can be a great help to you, and it can tell you, it can help you go where you go. In a competitive, if it's a 50-50 race, and there'll be several of those this year, analytics get you only so far. They can give you an indicator, they can give you a guess, and sometimes they can give you a guess with some certainty, but my personal value is you take good analytics and strong study of the data, strong study of historical trends, and then you go see people. Because elections in the end are still about people, and sometimes there are analytics that you get a surprise in a particular state. Something happens in a state. When Bill Bradley was in the United States Senate years ago, before most of you were born, he almost lost to Christy Todd Whitman. She went on to become the governor of New Jersey, but people in New Jersey were peeved, that's a gentle term, peeved about property taxes. Bill Bradley was the United States Senator. He has nothing to do with property taxes. But people were just in a lousy mood, and they were mad, and they wanted to take it out on somebody. So every now and then, all the analytics in the world don't tell you that people are peeved about something. So you have to go places. There are a lot of people, you're looking at a good group of people here who understand one of the great lessons of political reporting, which is you can learn a lot in Washington. There are a lot of smart people in Washington, but you got to get your butt out of Washington, because Washington is not America. I say that with no disrespect. Washington is not America. Gallup has this great survey, you can see it online, of what people think about the economy. The only place in America where people are optimistic about the economy is Washington, D.C. That's because it's largely, unless they shut it down, which they try every now and then, it's recession-proof. We don't have car factories. We don't manufacture things. We have the government, the defense industry, the technology industry, and it's largely recession-proof. And it's growing and booming, and the suburbs are wealthy. But the rest of America doesn't feel that. So you have a group here who I think agree with me that you study the analytics all you can. There's a lot to be learned. It can help you eliminate places to go. If your travel budget, if you work for a news organization that doesn't have as much money to spend, or you got to, these are the 3 days I can travel and there's 12 great races out there, you take analytics and then you say, all right, well, there's my target of, there's my question mark. The analytics might help me say, okay, question mark, and you go there.
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, I don't think that there's no split in my mind between analytics and horse race to say that it's either or, you do one kind or the other. Like, if I was smart enough to do what Nate Silver does, I'd do that too. I mean, I think that's brilliant, and I think it's great. And actually, he now works for the ESPN ABC family, and his website's launching in maybe just a week or two. And I'm
taking to Vegas with you.
Seriously, he's a poker player, actually. I think it's a huge value to the system. I don't think, though, that then replaces the need for reporting and for interviews and for talking to voters and for covering everything that's out there. The other thing, just in terms of thinking it through, I mean, the horse race is defined by polling. Analytics takes a lot of that same data. So it's not like it's you either cover just the horse race or you cover the analytics. I mean, we're talking about the Nate Silvers of the world are reliant on the kind of polling and the reporting that people like us do. And I'm very eager to see what he does in this cycle and what whoever the next one is that has something even better.
I mean, I don't think that there's any question that analytics and big data are fundamentally changing how campaigns are run. And from that perspective, it's something that's very important. And I think we're just starting to understand how that affected the presidential. I feel like we don't yet have a good understanding of how it will affect a midterm election. I think we'll probably see some of that here. But you have to remember that analytics are just measuring what people are feeling, right? So you can actually end up ahead of that analytical curve if you're out there understanding what people are going to be saying to the pollsters when they call. And for something like the Obama campaign, I mean, what they did was they figured out which people in the country were feeling the way, in a certain way that would make them vote for the president, and they went and made sure that they got them to the polls. So I think covering all of that is critical, and it all plays a role in the process.
I would say this will be my 4th presidential campaign, so John is ahead of me, and a lot of people.
I'm trying to say I'm old.
I am thinking about how do I cover campaigns differently. I really think that a lot of the coverage we do, particularly from about March to November of the general election, is about who's going to win and so on, and like analyzing every poll and counter poll. The averaging the polls out is a great innovation in terms of pretending that ABC pretends their poll showed this slight shift and NBC's. That's all silly. The people who said on before election day Mitt Romney was going to win, I don't read them anymore for their horse race coverage. I think that showed me that they didn't know what they were talking about. The other thing I'm trying to think of more is, at some point we've told you the race is close a lot. I think what I can do that you all can't do is I can interview Mark Pryor, I can interview Allison Grimes, I can find out from them what their goals are in public policy, how they think about the world, who are the people that are surrounding them. I'm trying to get more of my journalism personally around those questions that you can answer, as opposed to the questions that Nate Silver can do from his desk and does better than I do.
Politics is about people at the end of the day. It's like sort of where the word comes from.
So, and if I think everyone in this room, you wouldn't be here if you didn't understand this, if you weren't curious about this. But if you don't understand fully how much big data, as Kasie said, drives campaigns, this row right here would be a great textbook, because look at the great diversity you have right here in age and background and everything else. If the 6 of you right now had a laptop and went to the same website to read a political story, you would get different ads.
That's true.
And if you went on Facebook at the same time and went to some political content or some maybe even economic content about an issue a candidate cares about, you would get different content, because the campaign would think, because of your own personal stories, or your whether it's your income, whether it's your race, whether it's your ethnic background, whether it's where in the state you're from, if you were all in the same statewide thing, that you care about different things. And they know everything about you. And there's no putting this genie back in the bottle. There's no putting this. This is not just, the NSA listening to your phone calls. The campaigns know everything about you, everything you spend on your credit card, everything you buy. And it's just like if you I just bought a house almost a year ago now. Every time I still get furniture ads. Every time I log on to anything, I get furniture ads. I filled my house. Go away.
But a pair of shoes I resisted buying is back on my homepage.
See, the shoes are back. Let's sneak in a couple more questions.
What kind of effect, if any, do you think that the end of the midterm cycle is going to have on the states currently refusing Medicaid expansion?
That's a great question. There are a number of great governor's races out there. Do you guys see anybody? I mean, if they change hands, it could be an obvious answer. If Rick Scott loses in,
Florida is an issue where Crist is campaigning. The Medicaid expansion is an issue, and if he won, that would change the dynamic there. That's the most obvious one I can think of. I'll defer to Beth.
Except that there's such a Republican strong legislature there, and so even when Rick Scott seemed open to that, at some point the legislature slapped him down. And I think that is true in a number of races. There's a lot of governor's races in states that were carried by Obama, but Republicans won in 2010 in the wave, and so if those flip parties, which they could, that's obviously a big deal. But the legislatures have to flip too in order for there to be that kind of major policy change.
But that's a great question, because that'll be an issue more so.
Policy
That specific Medicaid issue would be, and that money will be an issue more in the governor's races probably than in the other House or the Senate races. But sometimes those factors bubble up and combine. Good. Good. Sure. You guys on the floor
Thank
can
you.
tell me where to go.
When like specifically focusing on the issue of dysfunctional government, I think it's clear we all just want the government to run well, at least in Washington D.C. At least that's where that's concerned. But when looking to where that the solvency of that is, have you guys seen that in the midterms or in the actual election? So the electorate kind of shaping functionality and choosing candidates that they think will be the best, or do you think that that's something that really is up to politicians on itself? Because looking at this midterm, I mean, even if the Republicans were to take the Senate, it still looks like there's obviously going to be divided government. Whether it be the Democrats maintaining the Senate, there still is that issue of dysfunctional government that we have today. So kind of where do you guys see the solvency for that line?
I think you're not supposed to say it, but voters have themselves to blame because they send conflicting messages on this. I mean, people say they want principled leaders, but they also want people to go and compromise. And that's, and we've had these crazy wave elections where you had 2006 and 2008 go in one direction, 2010 somewhere totally different, 2012 a little bit nudge in the different direction, and then 2014 will probably go more like 2010. So you end up with divided government. And people, John Boehner said 2 days after the election or day after the election, we have a mandate too. And he's right. The people just reelected a Republican House at the same time that they wiped out Mitt Romney. So I don't know. I don't want to just blame the public for this, but there's a reason that members of Congress are still fighting for principles against each other. They actually believe they're sent there, and in a lot of cases they're right. They're sent there by voters that want them to be advocating for these positions.
And I mean, I think that unfortunately right now there's no good answer to your question because I mean, trust in between the two parties in Washington is at an all-time low. And I can't seem to find anyone who, I cover the Senate every day, so I'm often talking to senators, and the breakdown is just sort of startling. And even though, many of these people have been serving together for decades, nobody seems to know how to move past it. And it's possible that this election could shake it up enough and change things to, to sort of break loose this sort of gridlock. But I mean, I just have trouble seeing it.
It's hard.
I realize that's very pessimistic.
It's hard to see it. To Rick's point, we got one over here. If you look at the map from the last presidential election, this doesn't happen that often. But Mitt Romney actually carried more House districts than President Obama did. And so there's this red America out there underneath this very blue presidency, and it's hard. And this is who the American people sent. Do the people of Omaha go to the polls thinking, do I want divided government or do I want united government? I don't think many voters actually process that question. But Omaha is different from San Francisco, it's different from El Paso, and this is what you get in a big, complicated country.
Sorry, Doug, you mentioned Omaha, which is one thing that of particular interest to me because in 2008, President Obama actually carried the Omaha-based congressional districts, that one little blue dot in the sea of red of Nebraska, and they called it Obamaha suddenly. So there was a
That's what Peyton Manning is saying down there?
Obamaha. But this is one of the reasons I think that there's a disaffection with President Obama, and a lot of young people feel turned off, is there was a promise in President Obama's election that something would change, that wow, we are the ones that we're waiting for, and something would wipe away a lot of these divisions and that we'd start to get things done. And then the way that he governed and the way the Democrats governed cut against that, and you can find the forces and you can blame it wherever you want, but there was a moment, and you guys are, no one in this room is that young, you won't remember 2008, there was a moment where after that election it was, well, maybe we've moved past something significant, maybe we've finally broken that fever and we're moving as a country something different. It didn't take long to backslide.
I'm going to talk about the premise of the question a little bit because I'm interested in this. There's a lot of talk about Washington is dysfunctional. In 2010, we elected a lot of people who said they want fewer bills to pass. Guess what? Rand Paul does not want bills to pass every day. He thinks the government should do less stuff. So the fact that it's dysfunctional is not passing bills, that was his entire intention, which he would tell you if you asked him. And so this whole notion that we want more bills to pass, well, I mean, Barack Obama does. I don't think that the Tea Party does. I don't think Rand Paul does. And I think that we have to think about, I think some people in Washington feel like Washington is working exactly as they want it to. It's not doing a lot, and they want the government to do less.
All right, who's got it? Who wants the floor?
So on that point, we have seen that in 2008 we had 50 blue dog Democrats in Congress, and now it's a dozen, I guess. And why do you think the center dwindled so much, and do you think that will continue on?
The center?
Yeah, this
Yeah,
sounds like
I think,
indulgence, like
you know,
There's actually, your mayor, Mayor Emanuel, had something to do with this in the way that he recruited and ran races in 2006. In that he targeted moderate Republicans, and when Republicans saw this done, they said, "Well, that was a really smart idea. We got to do the same thing to the Democrats." And there's a factor there. There isn't a working middle in Congress right now, in either the House or the Senate, and that's a longer term problem. There's no question about it. But it's a fact that, look, if you want to win seats, and this is a zero-sum game here, you're only 435 of these seats. If you want to win them, you gotta fish where there's fish in the sea, right?
And there are only 435 seats, and really only about 40 or 50 of them are competitive in any given election year. I mean, I'll close on this, and if anybody has a final comment, they should make it. If there's there are many cancers in our politics, but if there's a capital C cancer in our politics, in my view, it is that the House of Representatives, which is supposed to be the people's house, is not a competitive body anymore. Because there are so few competitive districts. And so the challenge, these Republicans who won't vote for immigration even though they want to because they're afraid they're going to go home and get primary challenged. Democrats who won't vote for maybe entitlement reforms or some things that, that are anathema to liberals, they don't even want to have a conversation about it, never mind a vote on it, because they're afraid the only way they're going to lose is if they get a primary challenge. And in 85 or 90% of the House districts, that's the case. And I would make the argument that you cannot have a functional government when one branch of it is just not really competitive anymore.
So I'm going to take advantage of my prerogative.
Who are you, sir?
I saw what was going on here. I wandered in. And I'm told your plane is slightly delayed, so...
So you got all the time.
So I have a three-part question.
Joe Biden will say
Well, first of all, on the redistricting question, I don't know how deeply you guys delved into that, but there are 12 states where you can do this by initiative, I think. But in the other states, they have to be done by the legislature. What are the odds, based on your political experiences, that politicians are going to give up the power to draw their own districts?
I would say, and please disagree with me because I hope you do, that it's unlikely. I mean, you did see the California experiment, which is really just beginning. California passed this new experiment, a new way to do it, and then you just had the census. So we won't really know, for what, 8 or 10 or 12 years, sort of how it plays out over time. I would hope, I'm not smart enough to figure out the best way to do it, but I would hope that there would be 8 or 10 or 12 laboratories, laboratories across the country for states where people get up and say, this just isn't working, let's try this. But you're asking, the one thing.
It's almost a rhetorical question.
Yeah, it is a rhetorical. It is a rhetorical question because there's two things the two parties agree on, which is don't change that system because they make it work for them, and don't do anything that allows a third party to emerge.
The only way, David, I see the changing is if a Michael Bloomberg or somebody got involved in like state by state.
And I think that may happen, but I don't know. But again, I think that's not going to influence legislation.
No, for them to take. I covered the Massachusetts legislature for a couple of years, and they're all Democrats in Massachusetts. Basically, redistricting was so nasty. Even when they didn't lose a House seat after the 2000 census, they were still screwing each other and moving towns back and forth. Right. It is so visceral. It is what politics is about, is who you represent. Right. And for them to just unilaterally give that up, I don't think is going to happen.
I think one of the principles that we have to keep in mind is that survival is the first instinct of politicians, and that's always the principle that you have to start with in analyzing some of the. There are those who break out of that, and they're real statesmen, and I don't think we should minimize that. But generally speaking, these politicians want to keep their jobs, and if they get an advantage by keeping the system, they will. Two other things. One is the minimum wage. What is your sense around the country of the minimum wage becoming a ballot issue in states as a means of encouraging higher turnout among Democrats?
I think it could be a great organizing tool. I mean, I think it's something that the unions are clearly organizing around that could, drive voters to the polls. But I'm not sure it could be one of those issues with the base that's like guns, where everyone has this opinion that we should all have universal background checks, but nobody votes on that issue, and the people who vote on that issue push it the other way.
Yeah. Economic issue, it's a little bit different, but it'd be interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the pushback from Republicans on, when you say Democrats are going to run on this, it's overwhelmingly popular, their pushback is, but people don't vote on it,
Well, I think that's a question. I think that's a good theory, but you're trying to push up turnout at the margins, and there are people who care about that issue, and particularly the people who are least likely to vote in these
especially in the
elections.
midterm, sure.
Yeah. Can you get it on a ballot, though, let's say in a place, I'm not sure if it's even allowed if they do these in Arkansas.
It's on,
Yeah,
it's going to be on
it's
Arkansas.
going to
So
be
you,
on
so you have
Arkansas.
you have in Arkansas when you have people like Pryor, people like Manchin, some of the more conservative Democrats don't want to touch it, in part not so much because they think it's bad policy, but because some of their money comes from a business community in their state that's telling them not to do it. So I think you get some cross pressures from the financial community in some of those places.
Last question. When I was on my way out, and I apologize for having to step out for a second, we were talking about the McConnell plan to crush the opposition, and there is this populist strain in the Republican Party. What are the chances that there's going to be a backlash to the sort of empire striking back here and the Washington establishment trying to muscle people out of the race? Or basically...
In Kentucky specifically, or across the country?
Well, just across the country. I mean, do you sense that? Is there a sense that, or are the Tea Party forces more on the run here?
Yeah, I'm kind of tending toward the latter answer right now. Now things can change, and some of the most successful primary challenges in the past were successful because we didn't see it until the very last second, and neither did the candidates. Everyone is clear-eyed this time around. I don't think anyone is naive to what the Tea Party can do. But it feels to me, in talking to Republicans and just reading the tea leaves of some of the comments from these Tea Party groups, is that they're not so certain that they're going to have the kind of influence they did in the past. That the establishment groups have struck back, and the big blows are being landed all the time, and that it may be that this is the year that no incumbent Republican senators fall in primaries.
I mean, I think that's the Ted Cruz effect, I think, is that, when the Tea Party was first forming and everybody was really excited about it, there was not necessarily, I mean, sure, you had people who would, typically tend to vote Democratic who thought that, the Tea Party was espousing ideas that were extreme, but you didn't have like a figure that represented sort of dysfunction and problems. And I think that that's tamped down a lot of the sort of excitement about these kinds of candidates.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of cruises go badly lately. So.
Race to Washington, Mississippi. Mississippi is the one race where I think Cochran could lose. I think there is some sense there. And I guess I'll repeat back to what you told us a little earlier is the Tea Party is winning in one way in that they're forcing every Republican candidate to the right. The difference between Matt Bevin and Mitch McConnell on public policy issues, I'm not sure I could describe to you very easily. And that's part of it is like the Tea Party may not be winning races anymore, but if you're shoving the Republican Party to the right, making it harder for 2016, hard to pass immigration reform, you are achieving the broader goal, which is to shift the country to the right.
I'm not going to turn around and look at anybody because they'll make me stop asking questions. So I just want to ask one last one.
Don't you own the place? This is
a filibuster.
Yeah. Speaking of Ted Cruz, lock the door. We're not going anywhere.
Do you like green eggs and ham?
But in your poll, Beth, there was an interesting, what seems to be kind of a paradox, which is that voters, when they talk about what they want from a member of Congress, they say they want someone who will cut spending,
Right.
who will bring public works back to their districts,
Right.
and they will not support anyone who will cut Social Security and Medicare.
Right.
And so I've been thinking about that.
Rick said earlier.
Yeah.
I blame the voters, but go ahead, Beth. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting finding, and I think it's definitely a problem because voters are sending mixed messages, and, they like the idea of a smaller budget, but don't touch my Social Security. So what's...
I've been trying to think, because I actually have a high regard for voters, although I think we should voters tend to hold politicians accountable, and nobody holds voters accountable for the decisions they make. I think people view Social Security and Medicare as an insurance program that they paid into. Mm-hmm. They don't view that as a federal spending program. They view it as an insurance program, and they feel that you shouldn't be cutting their insurance program in order to balance a budget that the politicians allowed to get out of balance. And when they say they want to cut spending, we all know they think a quarter of the budget is foreign aid, and they imagine that there's a lot more in that budget. You cover the Congress. It's kind of stunning when you realize how small the movable parts are.
Yeah, Rand Paul, I think, described it as, he said, one half is defense, one half of it is entitlements, half of the other half is defense, and half of the rest of that is stuff. And that stuff is discretionary spending, and it's just a very small, cutting that. I mean, if you don't tackle entitlements...
It was just a few years ago, because Congress has already made historic cuts. I'm being signal that,
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, I want to say that, yes, the voters have a huge stake in this and a responsibility to resolve some of their own conflicts. However, I think those conflicts are exacerbated by the trust deficit, in the sense that you make a key point about Social Security and Medicare. Well, if the politicians think some of the money has to come from there because we didn't understand where the demographics of the country were going when those programs were built, then the politicians have a responsibility to lead the conversation.
Yeah.
So you had a Bill Clinton traveling with a Rick Santorum back in the day to try to have this conversation. You had a George W. Bush when he wanted to touch Social Security. I know you disagree with the politics of it, but he traveled the country and sometimes had Democrats with him to have town halls, to have conversations about this. That's what's gone. The two parties won't even get in a room and have, let's say, we don't know what we're going to do, but here's a problem, or here's a big chunk of money we have to deal with, and at least start the conversation to involve people, involve the voters in the conversation about where you're trying to go with public policy goals. That is just gone because of the trust deficit, and so everyone's off in their corners. You know, they won't have a real conversation about background checks because the right says you're going to take away our guns, or the left says we won't give you, this because we won't get our piece of the train. Everything has to be comprehensive as opposed to incremental because nobody trusts each other.
Yeah, every issue is demagogued, and then the outside spenders just like jump in on it. And also, one thing on the trust deficit too is young people are convinced that Social Security and Medicare aren't going to be there for them, even though they're going to pay.
And that was reflected.
It was the Pew survey of millennials basically said, well, everyone thinks we should protect it, but no one actually thinks they're going to be relying on it.
Well, I thought I was outfoxing my colleagues, but they sent text messages to Stephen Edwards to nudge me and say we had to finish by 7:30. But I have to tell you, we thought this would be a great panel when we put it together, and you guys have lived up to our expectations. So I want to thank you all very much for being here.
Not one question about 2016. That's a good for you. Give yourselves a pat on the back. That's good.
See?